The sun rose over the Mississippi Delta in shades of orange and gray, spilling across the flat expanse of fields that stretched like a green sea under the weight of morning mist. From the distance, the Blackwood mansion rose above the horizon, a columned monument of wealth and terror, its whitewashed pillars gleaming like bones in the early light. To the enslaved, it was more than a house. It was a fortress of oppression, a place where laughter and cruelty intertwined, and the children of the Blackwoods learned their lessons in supremacy while we learned ours in silence and pain. I was 7 the first time I truly understood the meaning of fear. My name was Jacob then, though it would take years before that name became more than a label for property. I arrived at the plantation clutching the frayed sleeve of the woman who had carried me from my village, eyes wide with both curiosity and trepidation. The house loomed above me as we approached, the clapboard siding so bright it burned against the green of the Delta. Slave quarters sprawled in tidy lines behind the house, their walls darkened by decades of smoke and sweat. The air smelled of damp earth and the tang of iron from the chains that bound some of my fellow captives to labor. Inside the mansion, the rooms were cool and cavernous, with ceilings so high they made a boy feel as small as an insect. Every surface gleamed, mahogany furniture polished to a reflective shine, crystal chandeliers dripping with prisms of light, carpets so thick they swallowed footsteps. But wealth, I learned quickly, was a veneer stretched over the suffering of others. The Blackwood children, Robert and Elizabeth, were no more than vessels of the cruelty that ran through their blood, taught from birth that we were beneath them, that we existed only to serve or amuse. My earliest lessons were simple, yet brutal. A spilled tray of milk earned a whip across my back that left red welts searing for days. A word spoken in defiance drew a stare from Mrs. Catherine that could silence an entire line of house slaves. Master Edmund, with his silver hair and iron hands, had a different style. He demanded obedience through psychological calculation. He observed us as one might study insects, noting habits, weaknesses, and responses to pain. In those first weeks, I realized that the body could endure almost anything if the mind bent itself to survival, yet there were glimpses of what life could be. Lucy, another young slave, barely older than I was, became a companion in those early days. She moved with a grace that belied her small frame, carrying water and food for the younger children, sharing scraps of knowledge whispered from the older house slaves. We whispered about things we dared not say aloud: the rhythm of Master Edmund's footsteps in the hall, the timing of meals, which doors led to punishment, and which led to small privileges. These secrets became our first maps of survival, invisible routes in a landscape built for control. Even in childhood, cruelty was a curriculum. I watched as older slaves were broken, their spirits eroded piece by piece. Samuel, a man of great strength and dignity, learned that resistance brought not freedom, but escalation. Martha's fingers were twisted from repeated punishment, yet she smiled and nodded when ordered, teaching me that compliance was often the only way to survive the fury of those who saw us as objects. The mansion's walls echoed with screams and laughter, sometimes from the same room, sometimes from rooms across long hallways. It was a symphony of domination, and I began learning the melodies. I remember the first time I saw Lucy punished. Miss Elizabeth had taken a fancy to the girl, but her amusement quickly soured into cruelty. She pressed the hot iron to Lucy's palm, and the smell of burning flesh burned my stomach. Lucy cried, but the sound that cut through me most was not her scream, it was the laughter of the mistress, high-pitched and delighted, as if each note of pain was a reward. I felt an unfamiliar stirring in my chest, a mixture of horror and fascination. I realized then that cruelty could be taught, and that those who wielded it without conscience were almost invincible. By the time I was 10, I understood the rules of this strange, violent classroom. We were students in the art of survival, observing, listening, mimicking each gesture. Each careful calculation was a lesson. I polished shoes until they shone like mirrors, watched as Master Edmund inspected them with a discerning eye, and learned the exact pressure required to pass unnoticed. I carried messages up and down corridors, memorizing the routes, noting every lock, every hidden alcove where one could slip unseen. I became invisible, a shadow moving among predators. The Blackwood children grew into their cruelty as I grew into mine. Robert, tall and clever, discovered a talent for tormenting the animals first, then the smaller children, and eventually the slaves who worked closest to him. Elizabeth, with her delicate features and calculating intelligence, perfected the art of humiliation, learning which words could wound the most deeply without leaving marks. I watched and remembered. Every injustice, every insult, every cruel experiment became data, filed away in a mind trained to survive and one day to respond. By 13, my body had grown stronger, but my spirit had hardened in ways my masters could not imagine. I had learned to smile when commanded, to bow when ordered, and to disappear when danger approached. I had learned to read fear as well as any book. The quiver of a lip, the hesitation in a footstep, the subtle twitch of a hand near a weapon. I had also learned patience, the long, quiet endurance that made the eventual moment of reckoning more than possible. It made it inevitable. Yet, amid this calculated existence, I carried an ember of hope, fragile and fleeting, lit by the small kindnesses of those who had gone before me. Lucy's whispered words, Martha's sly guidance, the lessons from Samuel, they reminded me that even in a house built on terror, there were currents of humanity, faint but persistent. They taught me that understanding the enemy was the first step toward mastery, and in mastering the household, I would one day turn the lessons of cruelty back upon their creators. By the time I was 16, I had mapped every corridor, memorized every schedule, and internalized the rhythms of the Blackwood mansion. I knew who slept where, who drank what, and who was capable of true malice versus learned performance. I understood the power of observation, the necessity of patience, and the slow accumulation of strength. I had become a shadow of the boy who had arrived clutching a sleeve, but in that shadow lay the seeds of a storm that would one day sweep through the mansion with fire and steel. The mansion, with its columns and carpets, its chandeliers and silks, was both a cage and a classroom. In its hallways, I had grown from a frightened child into a calculating, patient young man, a student of violence, power, and the fine distinctions between survival and vengeance. Every act of cruelty I witnessed, every punishment endured, every life diminished in the service of wealth and amusement, was a lesson etched into my mind. And though the boy called Jacob still lived on the surface, beneath that mask of servitude, the future would see a different figure emerge, one forged in fire, sharpened by rage, and tempered by 7 years of deliberate, measured observation. When the sun sank below the delta horizon, casting long shadows across the plantation, I lay on the straw mattress in my quarters, listening to the distant laughter of the Blackwood children and the hushed whispers of the household staff. The first stage of my education was complete. The boy I had been frightened, obedient, silent had been forged in chains and corridors, and the man I would become waited patiently in the shadows, ready for the lessons to turn toward their inevitable conclusion. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when I was roused from my restless sleep by the harsh clang of the bell, calling the house slaves to labor. Every day was the same, yet that morning carried an ominous weight, a prelude to a ritual that would sear itself into my memory. The house was already alive with the movements of the Blackwoods' machinery of control, cooks calling out instructions, maids sweeping floors with precision, the low murmur of slaves moving through corridors like ghosts. I rose from my straw mattress, stiff from sleep, and followed the familiar path to the main hall, where the young Master Robert and Miss Elizabeth waited with their calculated expressions of cruelty. It was a clear lesson in hierarchy. The Blackwoods understood that the mind bends first when the body is broken, and this day was to be my formal induction into the brutal education that the family had perfected for generations. They had summoned me from the servants' quarters early, the smell of polished wood and heated iron thick in the air. I stood barefoot on the cold planks, heart hammering, though I had learned to mask emotion well. Behind me, other house slaves moved silently, aware that any misstep could invite punishment, any faltering glance could betray terror. The branding iron sat on a small table near the hearth, glowing faintly red in the morning light. Its heat seemed to radiate not only from the metal, but from the anticipation of those who would wield it and those who would suffer under it. The sound of the fire crackling, the soft footfalls of the overseer, and the subtle rustling of silk from Miss Elizabeth's gown blended into a symphony of dread. This instrument, mundane to the untrained eye, symbolized ownership, submission, and the destruction of identity. Today, it would become a teacher in its own right. Master Robert approached with the calculated precision of a young man who had been trained in cruelty, as one might be trained in music or rhetoric. His eyes, the pale blue of northern skies, held a gleam that spoke of anticipation and control. "Jacob," he said, voice smooth but authoritative, "today you learn your place. The mark will remind you, and all who see it, that obedience is not optional." His words, meant to instill fear, carried lessons I was memorizing for the future about psychology, about the manipulation of power, about the weaknesses of those who wielded authority. I nodded silently, my pulse quickening but my expression neutral. Master Robert had studied the art of punishment through observation of his father, and now he would apply it, eager to prove his understanding of domination. The branding iron hissed as it was lifted from the fire, its red-hot surface a warning that the body could indeed endure unimaginable pain if the mind submitted. I recalled the stories whispered among the older slaves, tales of those who screamed until fainting, only to rise and endure more. I remembered Samuel's long, stoic endurance, Martha's twisted fingers and resolute spirit, and Lucy's quiet strength despite every inflicted horror. Their lessons were embedded in my bones. Miss Elizabeth stepped forward, her small hands folded in front of her, eyes glimmering with the anticipation of the spectacle. Her cruelty, refined and deliberate, had been honed through years of observing her father and mother. She had a keen understanding of how terror could manipulate, how submission could be orchestrated with elegance. As she watched, I realized that her enjoyment was not in the immediate act of pain, but in the psychological layering, the anticipation, the fear, the trembling before the inevitable mark. The overseer, a hulking man with the physique of labor forged from decades of whippings and backbreaking work, restrained me. His hands were rough but precise, holding me in place while I steadied my own breathing. I felt the heat of the branding iron approach my skin, a red-hot promise that terror had a tangible form. The world narrowed to the hiss of metal, the measured breathing of my captors, and the rhythm of my own heart. In that instant, I became intensely aware of the lessons hidden in each detail, how fear could be measured, how anticipation could be manipulated, how pain could be transformed into control. The iron touched my flesh. The scream that erupted from my chest was not simply a reaction to burning. It was the sound of a young boy's innocence being stripped, a symphony of agony and endurance that would resonate within me for years. The smell of scorched skin filled the hall, mingling with the scent of beeswax, polished wood, and the faint aroma of cooking from the kitchen below. The overseer maintained his grip, unyielding, while Miss Elizabeth's eyes gleamed, recording every movement, every expression, as though the scene were a painting she would revisit over and over. When the iron was lifted, the skin on my shoulder was raw, blackened in parts, and throbbing with a searing, unrelenting pain. Yet I did not collapse. I did not falter. The pain, though acute, became a lesson, a teacher imparting knowledge about resilience, about the subtle power of composure in the face of unimaginable suffering. I clenched my fists, breathing through the agony, absorbing not just the physical burn but the psychological framework of domination that had been applied. Master Robert stepped back, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He saw the lesson as complete, not realizing that every action, every instruction, every gleam in his young eyes was being internalized by me in a way he could not comprehend. Miss Elizabeth whispered praises, carefully modulating her tone so that approval mingled with authority. I could feel the tension, the thrill of control that emanated from them both, and I stored it, filing it in my mind as one might catalogue a weapon. As the day progressed, I moved through the household performing tasks with the same mechanical precision I had learned over years, polishing silver, arranging linens, carrying messages, all while the pain in my shoulder throbbed beneath the careful folds of my shirt. I understood the deeper lesson that branding had imparted. Power was not simply in force but in perception. The visible mark was a signal to the world, but the internalization of control was the true mastery. Every glance, every command, every micro-expression I had observed became a thread in the tapestry of understanding that would later serve my vengeance. By dusk, I could barely lift my arm, yet my mind was sharper than ever. I replayed the morning endlessly, noting the cadence of Master Robert's commands, the exact way Miss Elizabeth's lips curved in satisfaction, the calculated indifference of the overseer. I realized that this pain, though inflicted, had made me more capable, more aware. It was the first formal lesson in the curriculum of cruelty that I would one day invert and wield as my own instrument. At night, when the mansion fell silent except for the creaking of the old floors and the distant hoot of an owl, I lay on the straw mattress, tracing the line of the burn on my shoulder. The skin was red and angry, a living map of domination. Yet beneath the surface, a different fire had begun to burn, a slow, deliberate, cold ember of rage and calculation. I thought of Lucy, of Samuel, of Martha, of every human life devalued by the Blackwood's wealth and whims. I imagined a day when the lessons I had learned would be returned, inverted, precise, and merciless. The branding had been intended to mark me as property, to remind me of my place, to instill obedience. Instead, it became my first teacher in the art of strategy, endurance, and observation. I learned to read the nuances of fear and power, to anticipate the weaknesses of those who wielded authority, and to store every detail for future use. The pain of the iron was fleeting compared to the lesson it etched into my mind. Knowledge of cruelty is a weapon, and those who teach it so freely often leave themselves defenseless to the student who learns too well. That night, I closed my eyes and imagined the mansion not as a place of confinement, but as a chessboard, every corridor and chamber a square, every slave and master a piece in a game that only I had learned to play. The mark on my shoulder throbbed with every heartbeat, a reminder that the curriculum of suffering had begun. 7 years would pass before the end, but in that moment, I understood the first rules: endurance, observation, and the quiet patience of a predator in training. The night was thick with humidity, the Mississippi Delta pressing down on the small slave quarters like a living weight. Spanish moss draped over the trees outside, swaying gently in the faint breeze, casting shadows that danced on the rough-hewn walls. Inside, I sat cross-legged on the straw mattress, the burn on my shoulder still throbbing from the morning branding, but my mind was sharper than ever. Pain had a way of clarifying thoughts, of focusing the mind, and in those quiet hours, I began the first careful stages of planning what would come. Every detail had to be precise, every step executed without error. Years of observation, years of hidden study had prepared me for this moment. I listened to the house breathing around me, the soft shuffle of feet in distant hallways, the occasional creak of a floorboard under a master's foot, the murmur of the river in the distance, a constant and indifferent witness to the suffering it had seen. These sounds, once background noise to my servitude, had become tools. I could estimate the position of any master, any overseer, any careless servant, by the subtlest shifts in rhythm. Every footstep was data, every sigh a clue. In the small hours I reviewed the routines of the Blackwood family in my mind, cataloguing every predictable movement, the breakfasts, the order of the servants' tasks, the timing of the carriage arrivals, the ways in which fear and hierarchy were enforced with subtle gestures and explicit punishment. Master Robert, with his obsessive attention to record-keeping, had unwittingly left a roadmap of weaknesses in his ledgers, journals, and correspondence. Miss Elizabeth's cruelty, polished and precise, revealed itself in patterns in her gestures, in the tempo of her speech, in the way she laughed at another's pain. Every detail mattered. I thought of Lucy, her body scarred but her spirit unbroken, and how she had endured more than any child should have. Her suffering became fuel, sharpening my focus. Samuel's quiet stoicism, Martha's resilience, the whispers of hope and despair I had overheard through walls and doorframes, all of it became data for the plan that was slowly crystallizing. This was not impulsive vengeance. It was calculated, methodical, a strategy honed by years of observing cruelty and learning its mechanics. I understood now that rebellion required patience. It was not simply a matter of strength or bravery, but of timing, psychology, and careful orchestration. By candlelight, I made crude sketches of the mansion's layout, noting the position of each bedroom, the likely locations of guards and overseers, the corridors that provided cover and escape. Each mark on the paper represented not just geography, but opportunity, a place where a footstep could be silenced, a door quietly unlocked, a pathway cleared for the inevitability that would unfold. The walls around me seemed to shrink as I bent over my task, the room becoming a crucible in which the strategy of 7 years of subjugation was being forged into the blueprint for liberation, or at least the liberation of justice as I defined it. The planning was meticulous. Every potential obstacle had to be accounted for. Who would awaken first? Which doors were locked? Where could I move unseen? And where would noise carry? The Blackwoods had never imagined a world in which their property could think independently, in which a young slave boy could study the mechanisms of oppression and invert them to his advantage. Their arrogance was a weapon I wielded silently, storing each misstep in memory, cataloguing every assumption they had made about power and compliance. As midnight approached, I moved through the quarter to gather supplies, the small shadows of my companions observing from the corners. Knives had been smuggled away from the kitchen over weeks, hidden under floorboards, under straw, under innocent objects that invited no suspicion. Each blade was cleaned and sharpened, its edge a promise of the work to come. I could almost hear the echoes of past lessons, the crack of whips, the screams, the subtle cues of those who wielded authority over others, all of it now coalescing into a symphony of potential. I recalled the instructions and lessons whispered among the older slaves, the coded advice shared in hushed tones, the way one could read the rhythms of a household to predict behavior. I had internalized these teachings, transforming them into a precise map of power dynamics, identifying weak points in the armor of white authority. The patience required to observe without revealing intention, the discipline required to endure brutality while silently planning, these were the skills that now served as my instruments. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of the river, damp earth and decomposing leaves, the aroma of the delta itself. The night seemed to watch with me, holding its breath. It was in these hours that strategy was born, that the seeds of rebellion were planted. I imagined the mansion, the halls, the rooms, the bedrooms, each a stage where the lessons of cruelty and the tools of vengeance would converge. I rehearsed the steps, movements, and timing in my mind, each simulation more detailed than the last, until the mansion existed within me as fully as it did in the world of wood and brick and silk. I remembered every word spoken by the Blackwoods that had mattered, every whispered insult, every lesson delivered under the guise of obedience training. The body can heal, but the spirit must be broken, Master Robert had said. And yet, in the quiet corners of my mind, I had been cataloguing, learning, observing. The iron on my shoulder had taught endurance, the lash had taught timing, the cruel lectures had taught me the psychology of power. Now, these lessons were tools for the execution of a plan that no one would anticipate. By the first hours of morning, I had rehearsed every movement a dozen times in my mind, until they became second nature. I understood the risks. If any step was miscalculated, if a door creaked at the wrong time, if a footstep carried a sound too far, the plan could unravel, and the cost would be immense. But I also understood the necessity. 7 years of watching, enduring, and learning had built a meticulous map of the vulnerabilities of the Blackwood household. It was now my responsibility to act upon it. In the shadows of the servant quarters, I whispered to myself, cataloguing the final details. Who would awaken first? Who would be easiest to subdue? Which corridors offered the quietest passage? I made mental notes of every guard rotation, every anticipated snore pattern, every door that might yield silently to a skilled hand. My body ached, my shoulder burned, but my mind raced ahead, constructing contingencies for contingencies, the mansion's every creak and whisper already folded into the calculus of vengeance. By dawn, the plan was complete. The mansion, once a symbol of oppression, was now a mental stage on which the lessons of cruelty would be returned to the Blackwoods in full measure. Every move had been rehearsed, every room accounted for, every master and guest a variable in the sequence of events that would come. The night's work had forged in me something new, a clarity of purpose, a readiness to act, a cold, methodical patience honed through years of observation and suffering. The sun rose over the Mississippi Delta, gray and humid, carrying the promise of rain and the weight of inevitability. As I prepared to face the day, performing my duties with mechanical precision, I knew that the seeds planted in the shadows would bear their bitter fruit. The mansion's halls were no longer merely corridors of confinement. They were the grid upon which justice would march, measured step by step, blade by blade, memory by memory. I would teach the Blackwoods the consequences of their arrogance. 7 years of suffering had taught me the language of power, the rhythm of fear, and the subtleties of control. Tonight, the mansion would no longer be merely a place of oppression. It would be the arena in which the student would finally become the master. In the quiet hours before dawn, in the shadows where others slept unaware, I rehearsed again, whispering every detail to myself. Movement, timing, targets, contingencies. The lesson of cruelty had been learned well, but it was now to be returned in a language they could never ignore. The drive up to the Blackwood house was a procession of pride, gleaming carriages, lacquered wheels, men in frock coats and women in gowns that rustled like dry leaves. Lanterns bobbed in the hands of footmen. Laughter floated thin and brittle above the padding of hooves. To the world outside the plantation, the scene read as refinement, the polite show of a society that measured worth in acres and receipts. To those who lived within the house, it was a crooked pageant, a ritual in which the powerful rehearsed the language of power while the powerless became props. That evening, the procession brought 12 guests, men and women, who would speak of dignity while trading in human degradation like merchants hawking wares. I stood in the hallway, a practiced phantom among embroidered coats and whispered compliments. My hands moved on instinct, decanting wine, arranging silver, smoothing the lapels of a man who would later boast of his dominion as if it were an accomplishment and not a theft. Faces I knew by sight but not by name smiled and nodded, their civility lubricated by brandy and appetite. In their pockets they carried the conviction that their world was unassailable, that the line between master and property was as immutable as the columns on their porches. They could not conceive of a mind beneath the polished veneer, mapping their habits like a predator. That ignorance would be their undoing. Inside the parlor, conversation flowed with the ease of long practice. They traded agricultural gossip, market tips, and the clinical theories thinly veiled about slave management that made my teeth ache when I heard them. "It's not the lash alone," Master Blackwood was saying, his voice calm as if discoursing on crop rotation. "One must engineer obedience, routines, small humiliations, the illusion of mercy. Break the family, break the resistance." His guests murmured agreement, trading notes like scientists comparing instruments. They talked of auctions like farmers discuss yields. They spoke of punishments like men reciting poetry. Miss Elizabeth, at her father's elbow, laughed at some anecdote about misbehaving hands in the fields, her laugh bright and casual as a bell. No one thought to look at the stains of labor on the hems of the invisible people who had prepared their supper. Catherine moved through the room with the fragile, rehearsed manners of a woman who never had to soil her fingers. She poured sherry for a dowager, adjusted a drape for a visiting colonel, and bade pleasant words that never touched the truth of her household. Her voice, soft as the powder on her cheek, hid a steel that had been sharpened over decades by the need to maintain appearances. She spoke of charity and the church with practiced piety, while in hidden rooms beneath the eaves the household's torments continued unseen. Their hypocrisy was a cloth so finely woven that they believed its sheen was moral light. The dinner itself was a masterclass in excess. Courses came one after another, ornate and overripe, as if the plates themselves wished to unnerve anyone who might notice the human cost of such abundance. Oysters that no slave would taste, peacocks roasted whole, sugar confections rolled in gold dust, lavishness staged as theatre. We moved like shadows, the household staff smoothing, replenishing, and erasing the traces of consumption long after the guests had turned to conversation and brandy. Between serving and clearing, I felt their words like blows, casual observations about training slaves, jokes that dissected a person's will as if it were meat. I recorded everything, every laugh, every learned aphorism, every quiet compliment between men who owned the power to ruin a life with a signature or a nod. As the table emptied of food and filled with brandy, the men drifted toward Master Blackwood's study for cigars and the indulgence of intellectual cruelty. The women repaired to the music room, where Miss Elizabeth, flute-like and poised, performed a few airs before settling to gossip and sherry. The house split along lines of gender and habit, each secluded group trading its own brand of insular cruelty, and each consumed with an arrogance born of inherited impunity. They felt safe, buoyed by the illusion of numbers and the surety of the night. Their guard was lowered by comfort, and comfort was a vulnerability I had learned to read like print. I moved where I needed to move. A refill here, a plate removed there, the casual smile that passes unnoticed by those who believe themselves superior. I listened through a keyhole to lectures on domestication, to the clinical manner in which they described families of slaves as problems to be solved, rather than human beings. I watched the way Colonel Morrison's hand linger idly near a pocket knife, how Judge Whitfield's chair sat slightly forward, as if he might rise to emphasize a moral calculus that never applied to his own affairs. These were the small details that would shape my night. Who could be diverted, who was quick to anger, who kept weapons close by instinct. Underneath all the ostentation was a chilling belief in the naturalness of their dominion. The guests spoke of rebellions only as inconveniences to be crushed, not as desperate pleas for dignity. One man boasted about a hanging he had ordered, speaking of the spectacle as a service to the community, as civic duty. Another recounted an incident of starving a laborer as discipline, described with the same detachment as a doctor prescribing a regimen. Their words were instruments, each sentence building the confidence that would make them careless. They performed their cruelty with the same lightness with which they raised glasses to toast their fortunes. Yet even amid the polished conversation, fissures showed small, telling slips, a drunken laugh that revealed contempt deeper than the surface, a glance too long toward a seam in a servant's sleeve, a whisper between two men that hinted at a private cruelty. Miss Elizabeth's laughter sometimes caught in the throat when conversation turned to punishments. Her eyes could harden with a look that had been practiced in private. The true nature of the house was never far from the surface, and those moments, those fleeting cracks, were what sharpened my resolve. I filed them away like clues, the better to use them when the moment came. As the clock leaned toward midnight and the candles sloped low, the guests grew slovenly with indulgence. Their fingers clumsy, their senses dulled by wine, they became less adept at reading the room for danger. It is always the small betrayals of civility that offer the greatest advantage. A nap induced by too much brandy, a laugh that becomes a snore, a pistol carelessly placed beside a nightstand. I watched these shifts with the cold patience I had honed over years. Power can be fragile when practiced by complacency. The masks of civility, no matter how finely made, could slip when at last the last carriage's wheels creaked away and the night's hush settled deep in the house like snow. The guests who remained retired upstairs, assured of their impregnability. They kissed handrails they had no right to touch and slept in beds crafted by hands they considered beneath notice. Downstairs, the servants whispered about the day's work, unaware of the storm that had been preparing around them. And I polished, obedient, unremarkable returned to my quarters, carrying in my mind the faces and phrases of the evening as if they were tinder and kindling. Every joke, every instruction, every casual admission was fuel. The masks of civility had done their work. They had exposed the soft underbelly of arrogance, and I had memorized its location. When the house finally fell silent, and the last cigarette ember in the study guttered toward ash, I lay awake in the dim quarters with the hum of the house in my ears. The night had taught me more than any lesson before about the habits of the guests, the slippages that make men vulnerable, and the exact cadence of drunken breath after a toast. The pageant had passed, leaving behind traces I would use like weapons. Outside, the Spanish moss shivered in a hush that felt like consent. Inside, the mansion's gilded faces slept, untroubled. The hour for justice drew near. By the time the house had surrendered to slumber, the shadows became my allies. Every step I took through the hallways was calculated, measured, silent, a ghost, moving through the opulent ruins of a world built on stolen lives. The candles burned low in their sconces, spilling light across portraits of ancestors who had never questioned the propriety of owning men, women, and children. Their eyes seemed to follow me, but I did not falter. For 7 years I had watched, I had learned, I had stored every injustice like a ledger of wrath. Now the night belonged to me. The mansion was a labyrinth of excess. Persian carpets muffled my footsteps. Polished mahogany and marble reflected the faint glow of the dying candles, creating a corridor of illusions where luxury masked decay. Each room I passed was a theater of power and arrogance. Tapestries illustrated pastoral wealth. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen tears, and delicate porcelain figurines populated tables and mantels, unseeing witnesses to a legacy of cruelty. The contrast between beauty and brutality filled me with a cold joy. For tonight, all that polish, all that grandeur would serve as the stage for retribution. I paused in the hallway outside Colonel Morrison's room. Wealth and entitlement made him careless. Doors unlocked, windows slightly ajar, he believed no one beneath him could harm him. The snores that drifted through the crack beneath the door were the rhythm of arrogance, a heartbeat I could follow into oblivion. I pressed my hand to the knob, the knife in my other hand warm against my palm. 7 years of servitude had taught me patience, precision, the intimacy of silence. I did not hesitate. The door opened without a sound. Inside, the colonel slept with his wife curled beside him, the moonlight illuminating the ease with which they assumed safety. The knife found his throat with deliberate gentleness, a red blossom opening beneath my fingertips. His life drained into the silk sheets he had never considered stained by human toil. His wife awoke in a panic, but the blade's lesson was swift and merciless, silencing her screams before they could cross the room. They were the first, but not the last. Each life taken tonight was a ledger entry, a balance of years of cruelty repaid in steel and precision. Judge Whitfield's room was next. Unlike the colonel, he saw me approaching, eyes widening in the recognition of impossibility. "Jacob," he whispered, fear cutting through sleep. But recognition came too late. Experience, observation, and the practiced hands of someone who had endured cruelty without flinching allowed me to move faster than thought. The knife spoke, delivering the justice he had long deserved. His wife, away in New Orleans, remained ignorant of the fate planned for her by association. Justice, unlike cruelty, can be impartial. Dr. Hartwell presented a challenge. Wakeful and aware, his hand reached for the pistol beside him. But panic is a luxury to be exploited. I anticipated every movement, every twitch of the wrist, every second of hesitation. The knife found his hand first, severing his attempt at resistance. His screams were brief, fading into the velvet darkness of the night, swallowed by the house that had nurtured both cruelty and vengeance. With each act, I felt the culmination of years of observation, the refinement of skill honed on the edge of survival. The remaining guests succumbed quickly, efficiently, with the methodical patience of someone accustomed to both suffering and retribution. Each death corresponded to a crime observed, catalogued, and remembered. The merchant who had treated human life as property, the lawyer who had sanctioned bondage in courts of law, the banker who had calculated profit from flesh and lives, each fell in sequence. By 4 o'clock, 6 guests lay dead in rooms lined with Egyptian cotton sheets, their lifeblood seeping into the fabric of opulence, mingling with the silence that now settled over the mansion. But the true architects of cruelty remained Master Blackwood and his wife, the linchpins of a system that had poisoned my childhood and every life I had known. Their bedchamber loomed at the end of the hallway, an altar of luxury built on suffering. Silk wallpaper, imported furniture, and intricate tapestries surrounded them as they slept. Master Blackwood's silver hair spread across a pillow stuffed with down, his breaths deep and even. Beside him, Mrs. Blackwood lay curled, her aristocratic slumber undisturbed by the carnage beneath her roof. The knife in my hand became the instrument of final reckoning. I paused, listening to their measured breaths, cataloguing every cruelty they had inflicted: Lucy's scars, Samuel's broken body, Martha's mangled fingers. Every instance of oppression that had passed under my watchful eye was now a debt that demanded settlement. My heart pulsed with righteous fury, each beat synchronizing with the blade, every pulse a note in the symphony of vengeance. This was no longer the act of a boy who had endured. It was the assertion of a force forged in pain and perfected in patience. The moment I entered their room, the world tilted. Master Blackwood's eyes opened, just as the knife brushed his throat, disbelief painting his features. "Jacob," he whispered, attempting authority in a situation where none could exist. The years of cruelty he had wielded like a weapon could not defend him from the outcome of his own lessons. "I'm finishing what you started," I said, calm as the tide, the voice of all the suppressed agony of the years past. "Tonight, the teacher learns from the student. Tonight, the rules of your house are rewritten in blood." The knife cut with a deliberate rhythm, each motion a punctuation in the story of cruelty and justice. He struggled to speak, but only bubbles escaped, and then silence. Mrs. Blackwood tried to rise, but terror locked her limbs. The knife found her heart, piercing the silk and the illusion of superiority to reach the pulse of guiltless years. They died together, intertwined in death as they had lived in tyranny. Their final moments were both a reckoning and a testimony to the power that had lain dormant beneath the surface of servitude. Yet there remained Master Robert and Miss Elizabeth, the final inheritors of the Blackwood legacy. The narrow staircase to the 3rd floor creaked only faintly under my feet. Locks clicked open under my practiced fingers. Master Robert sat at his desk, unaware that his lessons in cruelty were about to be applied to him. The candlelight revealed his meticulous notes, the strategies he had devised for future torment. He lunged for a pistol, but youth and panic could not withstand the precision and patience I had cultivated over 7 years. The knife found its mark, a curriculum in pain written in steel. Finally, Miss Elizabeth waited in her canopy bed, wide-eyed with dawning comprehension of the night's events. Her hands had inflicted suffering, and now the instruments of vengeance approached her. I met her attempts at flight with anticipation, catching her before escape could take her. "This is for Lucy, for Samuel, for Martha," I whispered, and the lesson was concluded. Her life ended as all others had, a mirror of the cruelty she had learned and practiced. Standing in the hallway of the Blackwood mansion, I felt an overwhelming peace. 16 lives had been taken, each precisely accounted for, each death a response to years of suffering. Yet the fire that would follow was necessary to communicate that the end was both literal and symbolic. The Blackwood estate would burn, a signal to all within the Mississippi Delta that justice, long deferred, could erupt from the most unassuming places. The mansion had been a monument to oppression. It would become a monument to reckoning, a story etched into history through smoke, fire, and the echoes of vengeance. The kindling was gathered, journals and ledgers included, the flames licking quickly into life. The mansion became a beacon, roaring into the night, visible for miles, a warning to all who believed themselves untouchable. I watched from the yard as 30 years of accumulated wealth and cruelty dissolved into fire, leaving only ashes and memory behind. And as dawn crept over the delta, I walked away, leaving Jacob, the boy, to die within the flames, and stepping forward into the man who had chosen freedom through fire, blood, and justice. The house took to flame like a confession. It began in the study, in the journals and ledgers that recorded cruelty with the same clinical calm as an accountant balancing a ledger. I stacked them with care, the ink-stained pages, the notation of experiments, the lists of punishments and profits, then drew the matches one by one as if handling relics. The first spark licked the brittle edges, and the paper sighed, a soft sound like the giving of a long-held secret. Paper became tinder, and tinder became the tongue of a hungry thing that remembered centuries of tinder. Night pulled the darkness tight around the mansion, while the fire climbed, patient and implacable. It moved along the baseboards, slipped beneath rugs, found the seams where the expensive wood had been joined, and fed on polish and oil and the histories hidden in the pores of the furniture. The flames smelled of lacquer and old smoke, but there was another sweetness there, charred ledger, and human arrogance made into ash. I did not watch the house burn as a vandal might. I watched as one witnessing the end of a sentence, the punctuation that justice had long demanded. Each flare was an epitaph. Each crack of collapsing beam sounded like a verdict. From the yard, I stood like a man who had returned from the front lines, watching an edifice of power reduce itself to embers. The light painted the cotton fields in an infernal gold, turning the Delta world momentarily upside down as night became day around the blaze. Far off, other plantations blinked into consciousness, lamps lit, windows opened, and silhouettes moved as riders spurred toward the source of light and rumor. For a breath I felt almost mythic. The Blackwood mansion roared, and the low country answered with the whisper of horses and the frantic clatter of men who would not be puzzled by moral quandaries. Back in the quarters, the slaves gathered like a congregation before some holy, terrible altar. They watched from the gaps between cabins, faces upturned and reflecting the firelight, the awe indistinguishable from relief. Some wept softly, others whispered names, and old Samuel stood with his mouth open as though tasting the heat with his tongue. Lucy's name drifted across the yard in muttered prayers and curses balanced together. For them, the fire was not only destruction, it was recognition, an event that acknowledged their suffering and finally named it in a way the Blackwood's ledger never had. But I had no desire to linger in spectacle. The blaze was a signal and a curtain. It consumed evidence, the journals that mapped cruelty, the physical proofs of what had been done in the name of profit. The flames would also, inevitably, become testimony. People would point to the ruin and assign meaning. I preferred the ambiguity of smoke and disappearance. I had planned contingencies for the manhunt I knew would come. I had prepared routes through marsh and coppice, hidden caches of food and clothing, and a ragged network of trustworthy faces who had learned silence from the same master. My escape was as deliberate as everything else had been. The world outside narrowed to the necessary details, the damp of the marsh that would clog a boot and a scent, the shallow trails that cut through the reeds and dead cane, and the distant road where riders might come fast with lanterns and accusations. I had practiced the path at night, in the hum of frogs and the rustle of leaves, slipping between trunks until I was no longer a shadow but a memory. The swamp conspired to hide what the law sought to reveal. Its water and mud held secrets like a lover. I moved through it deliberately, taking breaths that matched my stride and keeping my mind on the tasks ahead. When riders finally arrived, men on horseback with faces hard from money and whiskey and righteous anger, they found ruin and bodies and a smell that would cling to their nostrils for years. They stamped and shouted, pointing and accusing as if the world could be made whole by declaring a culprit. A reward was posted large and obscene, and a manhunt assembled with the zealous certainty of justice pursued. Men tracked the obvious trails, the carriage roads, the river path, and the tracks leading away from the estate. They followed prints and rumors, and every weak thread of pride they believed would lead them to the perpetrator. They did not look in the places that mattered, the swamps, the reed beds, the small cabins where a living legend might slide between breaths. Rumors are a form of shelter. They clothed me when the law wanted a body. Some said I had been burned in the house, consumed in the flames like penitent ash. Others said I had fled north by riverboat, hidden by abolitionists and guides on the Underground Railroad. Still others whispered of a boy who had become a wraith in the cypress swamps, surviving by cunning and the bitter lessons learned in the big house. Each narrative served its audience. To the masters, the idea of final immolation reassured the logic of punishment. To sympathetic ears, the tale of escape breathed resistance and possibility into the weary. I left those stories to grow and curl like smoke, useful, protective, and unshakable. Days turned to weeks, and the governor's reward hung like a grotesque decoration in the papers and on tavern walls. Men chased leads, interrogated cab drivers and river pilots, read the whispers of folk who trafficked in rumor for coin. They questioned known fugitives and rounded up those suspected of harboring the escaped, beating them into confession or silence. The plantation owners used the opportunity to tighten their own systems of control, fearing contagion of revolt. They mounted patrols, lit watchfires, and instituted curfews. In the slave quarters, the mood was a brittle mix of triumph and fear. Freedom had a price, and the price often was a harvest of suffering elsewhere. In the months that followed, the place where the Blackwood mansion had stood became a figure of stories. Children dared one another to touch the blackened stones. Passers-by gave the ruin a wide berth, attuned to a place where tragically public things had occurred. The land, which had once been ploughed and planted with cotton, lay fallow. New buyers shied away from property where blood-soaked legend shadowed the soil. Some said the ground was cursed. Others swore it hummed with a different kind of power. For runaways and those who kept their feet free, the burned estate was a waypoint, a shrine, a cautionary tale, and a beacon all at once. I did not remain to witness the long settling of rumor into legend. My business was different: survival, movement, and the careful reconstitution of a life that refused the contours of bondage. I walked in a direction that kept the fire at my back and the marsh at my forefront, carrying with me nothing but a careful cache of memories and the instruments I would need to vanish. I had been forged by cruelty, but I had not been made for spectacle. The stories that would become whispered tales of the butcher of Mississippi were not my work. They were the work of those who would tell them, each adding a new shade, a new justification, and a new lesson. As years passed, the fire's glow would be a thing of memory, the edges of the event softened by time and retelling. Yet, in the quarters where Lucy had laughed and Samuel had worked and Martha had sliced and sewn, the embers of that night were kept alive differently. They were kept in songs, in prayers, in the hushed recounting of injustice, and in the names called quietly at dusk. There, the fire did not merely destroy, absolved in part, bringing a visible and undeniable alteration to a world that had been ordered by cruelty. In that small, stubborn way, the flames had done more than consume. They had marked a turning point in the living memory of those who had suffered. I stepped into the marsh and let the green of the delta fold around me. The fire dwindled behind, a bright wound on the landscape. Ahead lay water, then new ground, then the uncertain road that might lead anywhere. I walked and did not look back, for looking backward is a temptation that leads to stalling. The legend could burn, or it could grow. Either way, I would move through what remained, a man no longer property but a presence in the margins of the world, unseen, unclaimed, and perhaps finally free. The Mississippi swamp spread like a green-black ocean, reeds rising like jagged sails and cypress trees looming with twisted, gnarled faces that seemed to watch every move. I moved through them silently, letting the soft, cold mud pull at my feet, grounding me in the present as the flames of the Blackwood mansion faded behind me. My body ached from the night's work, every muscle throbbing, but pain had become a familiar companion, an echo of what had been endured, a reminder of what I had survived. The night air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and decay, and the slow drip of water from the Spanish moss above filled the silence with an uneven, mournful rhythm. The first few hours were crucial. The law would be combing the roads, questioning neighbors, and pursuing any sign of movement from the direction of the plantation. I had to vanish into the land itself. Every step I took was measured, deliberate. I left false trails where possible, dragging sticks across soft earth to confuse anyone tracking prints, masking my path in water where footprints could not hold. Hours slipped by like shadows, lengthening at dusk, and dawn found me still moving, the first light cutting thin lines through the reeds, painting everything in pale green and gold. There was a strange clarity in the hour. After a night of fire and blood, the world seemed to hold its breath, acknowledging the absolution and chaos that had unfolded. I found temporary refuge in a hollowed-out cypress, its trunk wide enough to hide a body from casual observation. Inside, I listened to the wind and the distant cries of birds, letting my mind replay the events of the previous night with the same precision that had guided me through the killings. I thought of Lucy, of Samuel, of Martha, names that had carried my rage and my grief. I thought of the Blackwoods and their guests, of their arrogance and cruelty, of the lesson I had delivered with patience and steel. And yet, in the hollow, I realized that my fight had ended only in the physical sense. The world was still populated by those who would own, oppress, and destroy if given the opportunity. The battle was never over. It had only transformed. I allowed myself brief moments of rest, curled against the damp wood and swallowing water from the swamp in measured sips. Hunger gnawed at my stomach, but necessity imposed discipline. I moved slowly, keeping to shadows and using every bit of knowledge acquired from years of servitude. The land itself seemed to understand my purpose, offering concealment in the dark pools of water, in the dense underbrush, and in the labyrinthine channels that cut through the delta. I had become a phantom, an entity that existed between the world of the living and the fire-scarred past I had left behind. Days passed in careful motion. I avoided towns, traveled by night, and relied on the kindness of a few trusted souls who had resisted the tyranny of planters in their own small ways. They provided food and temporary shelter, offering me maps of backwater trails, the location of abandoned cabins, and warnings of patrols. Every encounter reminded me of the precarious balance between life and annihilation. Every kindness was a reminder that humanity, though buried, still existed outside the Blackwood shadow. Each interaction also reinforced a truth. My identity had shifted. I was no longer Jacob the slave, the boy who polished boots and endured daily humiliation. I had become a creature defined by survival, knowledge, and the ghostly echo of vengeance. As I moved, the manhunt intensified. Notices posted in taverns along roadsides and in the hands of sheriffs and deputies carried my name, or rather, the name they believed I bore, Jacob. The reward of $5,000 hung like a golden noose around the neck of anyone who might aid me. But by now, the world knew me only through stories, rumors, and the shadow I left behind. The fire, the deaths, and my disappearance had merged into myth. Each retelling added layers, painting me sometimes as a hero, sometimes as a monster. I allowed the stories to grow because they served as camouflage. Hunters pursued the legend, not the man. Weeks turned to months. I learned to navigate the swamps and lowlands with an almost supernatural awareness, reading subtle shifts in the wind and water, listening to the sounds of the delta as a map. I used the cover of night to travel longer distances, always staying one step ahead of patrols, always aware of the price that hung over my head. The delta became both teacher and protector, its hidden passages and treacherous waters serving as barriers against pursuit. I understood the land in a way that only those who had been hunted could. Every broken branch, every disturbed leaf, every ripple in the water spoke to me in a language older than words. In the quiet hours before dawn, I often paused to reflect on what I had become. The acts of the night at the Blackwood mansion had changed me irrevocably. There was a weight, an invisible mantle, carried in every step. I was free, yet the freedom was hard-won, shaped in fire and blood. The delta whispered of possibilities, but it also reminded me of limits. There were places I could never tread, names I could never speak, and moments I could never reclaim. The memory of each death remained etched in my mind, a ledger of justice that was both comforting and haunting. Slowly I constructed a new identity. Jacob the slave was buried in the fire. Jacob the butcher of Mississippi existed now as an idea, a presence that haunted the southern landscape. I changed my appearance when necessary, adopting clothing that allowed me to blend with laborers, wanderers, and travelers. I learned the dialects and codes of the swamp communities, becoming fluent in a language of secrecy and survival. Names, faces, and locations shifted. Each new persona was a tool, a shield, a way to navigate a world that sought to erase me. By the end of the first year, I had established a tenuous network of safe havens, hidden cabins, sympathetic farmsteads, and swamp enclaves where those who had resisted oppression could survive. I sent messages in code, sometimes through letters disguised as mundane correspondence, sometimes through trusted intermediaries who understood the stakes. The delta was vast, and the reach of law limited. I exploited this geography to its fullest. My existence became a balance of visibility and disappearance, a careful dance that ensured survival while allowing the legend of the butcher to flourish. Even as I built this new life, the memory of the fire and the mansion lingered. I revisited the site under cover of darkness, watching as the land slowly healed over the ruins. Blackened timbers had collapsed entirely, the swamp reclaiming the soil. Cotton once planted lay in decay, and new growth began to emerge in tentative green shoots. The memory of 16 deaths remained, embedded not just in the land, but in the consciousness of those who had witnessed or heard the stories. My presence there was a quiet affirmation. What had been destroyed could not be rebuilt without acknowledging the cost, the blood that had been spilled, and the lives that had suffered. I moved forward, step by step, through the delta and beyond, carrying both memory and purpose. My freedom was hard-earned and precarious, my identity a construct of survival and myth. I was both invisible and unforgettable, a shadow, moving through a world that had sought to define me as nothing, yet could not erase the power of what I had become. Every sunrise over the waterlogged fields, every whisper of wind through the moss-laden trees, reminded me of the lessons of the past. Cruelty breeds vengeance, silence invites judgment, and even the most oppressed can carve a path through the darkness if they dare to claim it. Through patience, calculation, and an unshakable will, I had moved from the boy who served to the man who existed beyond ownership. My name was no longer tied to chains or masters. It was tied to actions, to fire, and to memory. The Mississippi Delta had forged me in its shadows, tempered by rage and survival, and released me as someone neither wholly human nor wholly legend. I walked on, aware that each step carried both a threat and a promise, a living testament to the capacity of the oppressed to become the agents of reckoning when the time demanded it. The swamp was my cathedral, the Delta my sanctuary. I had been Jacob the slave, and I had died. I had been Jacob the butcher, and I had vanished. Now, I existed as something entirely new, a presence defined by choice, by cunning, and by the indelible scars of a past that had shaped me into both avenger and survivor. No one could capture me because I had become untraceable. No one could claim me because I had claimed myself. And in the quiet moments when the Delta breathed around me like a living thing, I felt the truth settle deep in my bones. Freedom, when won through fire and blood, tastes of both ash and eternity. The days and nights after the fire were a blur of muted colors and whispered secrets. The Delta stretched endlessly around me, a labyrinth of black waters and dense undergrowth, and I moved through it with the careful precision of a ghost. Each step was deliberate, each sound weighed against the risk of discovery. By now, the stories of the Blackwood massacre had spread like wildfire across the plantations of Mississippi. Travelers, traders, and gossiping neighbors spoke in hushed tones of the Butcher of Mississippi, a name that carried with it fear, awe, and the lingering sense of justice served. My presence was invisible, yet omnipresent in their minds, an idea more terrifying than any man could be. For months, I lived in the shadows, feeding on the land and the kindness of those few who still dared to resist the tyranny of the planters. I had no fixed home. Every cabin, every hollow tree, every swamp enclave was temporary, a stop along a journey defined by survival and secrecy. I learned to read the Delta as others read books, each ripple in the water, each rustle of moss, each bird call a language of movement and warning. I moved mostly by night, when the thick darkness swallowed my form and even the keenest eyes struggled to discern shape or motion. Daylight was a vulnerability, and I embraced it only in rare moments when the sun burned high enough to disperse the early morning mist. The manhunt continued, relentless yet futile. Notices plastered on tavern doors and county posts offered ever-growing rewards, each one a testament to the fear I had sown. Hunters scoured the roads and the swamps, tracking rumors and sightings, yet I was never there when they arrived. Every trap I evaded, every patrol I escaped, reinforced my new identity. Jacob was dead, and what existed now was something born from fire, blood, and a relentless will to survive. The legend grew faster than the hunters could chase, a shadow that could not be caught, a whisper carried by the wind through the cypress and moss. I began to understand, deeply, what it meant to exist as both man and myth. The stories, told by the few who had seen or survived my actions, became my camouflage. Plantation owners warned one another of the butcher, describing a young slave who moved like smoke and struck with the precision of a surgeon. Yet they described a figure who could not be pinned down, who could vanish into the swamp, leaving only chaos and fear behind. I allowed these stories to take on a life of their own, crafting my movements so that they matched the growing narrative, ensuring that those who sought me would chase shadows while I moved freely through the Delta and beyond. Survival demanded more than stealth, it demanded strategy. I had learned from the Blackwoods that information and knowledge were as powerful as steel. I listened, observed, and memorized, creating networks of allies and informants. Fugitive slaves, sympathetic farmers, and itinerant travelers became parts of a web of communication and protection. Through them, I learned which roads were safe, which rivers offered concealment, and which settlements harbored those loyal to the planters' vision of oppression. I never trusted fully, never lingered long, but the network allowed me to extend my influence beyond what any one body could do alone. The Delta itself became a teacher. I learned to navigate its labyrinthine channels, to read the stars reflected in its black waters, and to use the natural features of the swamp as both guide and defense. I discovered hidden islands where fresh water pooled, caves carved into limestone cliffs, and forgotten cabins abandoned by settlers. Each became a temporary sanctuary, a place to rest, to plan, and to exist without the constant fear of discovery. The Delta's vastness was a shield, its complexity a puzzle that only someone intimately familiar with its moods could navigate. I had become part of it, moving with a fluency born from necessity, a rhythm matched to the flow of the rivers and the whisper of the wind through Spanish moss. As the months turned to years, I began to cultivate a reputation not just as a ghost or a shadow, but as a symbol. Slaves whispered my story in quarters, passing down the narrative of Jacob the butcher, who had dared to stand against the tyranny of the Blackwoods and had emerged not merely as survivor but as judge, jury, and executioner. The tale spread beyond Mississippi, carried by travelers, merchants, and escaped slaves who understood the power of legend. It became a warning and a beacon simultaneously, a warning to oppressors that cruelty carries consequences, and a beacon to the enslaved that vengeance and justice could take many forms. In the quiet hours, alone in a hollowed tree or tucked into the corner of a hidden cabin, I contemplated the nature of what I had become. I was no longer Jacob, the boy who had polished boots and endured beatings. I was neither fully man nor fully myth, but something forged in the crucible of rage, survival, and purpose. The Delta had refined me, shaping instincts into skill, fear into strategy, and grief into clarity. Every movement was deliberate, every decision calculated. I had shed the constraints of ownership and expectation, becoming a force defined by choice, action, and consequence. Despite the isolation, I was not lonely. The land itself became a companion, its sounds and rhythms a form of communication. The distant cries of birds, the ripple of fish beneath the black water, and the sway of reeds in the wind spoke to me in ways no human could. I found solace in this language, a reminder that even amidst destruction and chaos, life persisted. My connection to the Delta was both practical and spiritual. It was the source of my safety, my knowledge, and my sense of purpose. Here, I was untouchable, free, and fully present in a world that had once sought to define me solely as property. Over time, I adopted new identities, blending with wanderers, laborers, and escaped slaves. Each persona allowed me to interact with the world without revealing the full truth of my existence. I could pass through towns, trade for supplies, and move across state lines without fear of immediate recognition. The myth of Jacob the butcher worked as armor, ensuring that even those who glimpsed me at a distance hesitated, weighed down by fear and uncertainty. I became a study in contrasts, visible yet invisible, feared yet respected, human yet elevated into legend. Yet, despite the careful construction of my new life, I never forgot the faces of the Blackwoods, their guests, or the suffering they had caused. Memory served as a compass, guiding my actions and reinforcing the purpose behind my existence. Each survival, each evasion, each calculated movement through the Delta was a testament to what had been endured and what had been achieved. The lessons I had learned were as much about strategy, patience, and observation as they were about vengeance and justice. I had become an instrument of both reckoning and preservation, balancing the demands of survival with the echoes of the past. As the years unfolded, I came to understand the full scope of what I had initiated. The Blackwood plantation remained abandoned, a testament to the fire and blood that had consumed it. Its ruins became legend, a physical reminder of the consequences of cruelty and oppression. Other plantations whispered of the event, planting seeds of fear and caution among those who profited from human suffering. My actions had reverberated far beyond the walls of the Blackwood mansion, creating ripples that extended through the Delta and into the consciousness of both the oppressed and the oppressors. By the time I had spent a decade moving through the swamps and lowlands, I had cultivated not just survival but mastery of my environment. I became a teacher of stealth, a master of camouflage, and a living symbol of resistance. Stories of my deeds circulated, inspiring both fear and hope, ensuring that the narrative of rebellion and justice would live long after my footsteps were gone. I had become more than a man. I was an idea, a shadow, and a force that could not be contained by law, geography, or societal expectation. In this new life, I found a form of peace, not the naive tranquility of youth, but the hard-won calm of someone who has faced death and emerged unbroken. The Delta had become my home, my protector, and my witness. Every sunrise over its black waters, every whisper of wind through the moss, every movement of water and creature reinforced the truth I had learned through fire and blood. Freedom, when seized with clarity and purpose, transcends ownership, fear, and mortality. I had become the Delta itself, in a sense, elusive, enduring, and omnipresent, an entity that flowed through the world unseen, shaping history in small but indelible ways. And in that quiet understanding, I finally embraced the full extent of my transformation. Jacob the slave had died in the fire, and Jacob the butcher had vanished into legend. What remained was something greater, a being forged from suffering, tempered in vengeance, and reborn in the shadows, a presence that no master, law, or system could ever contain. Freedom was no longer just a concept. It was a reality shaped in motion, strategy, and legend. And in the darkness of the Mississippi Delta, I walked forward, a phantom among the reeds, a shadow among the cypress, carrying with me the memory of the past, the lessons of survival, and the unshakable knowledge that even the most oppressed could rise, transform, and leave a mark that would echo through generations. The Delta had changed me in ways no plantation, no master, no chain could ever have anticipated. In the aftermath of the Blackwood massacre, I had become more than just a man. I had become a symbol of defiance, a shadow moving through the lowlands, carrying the weight of justice and vengeance alike. Jacob the slave was gone, and in his place stood something both feared and revered, a force born from fire, blood, and relentless determination. The landscape itself seemed to bend to my presence. Spanish moss swayed with an almost conspiratorial rhythm. The black waters mirrored my movements with uncanny precision, and the cries of distant creatures became signals I could read as easily as a map. No reward, no bounty, no manhunt could capture me. Each notice posted by frightened planters only reinforced the myth. They imagined a boy chasing freedom, yet what they did not understand was that I had become untethered from their definitions of time, space, and mortality. I moved not as a fugitive but as a ghost. Every shadow I crossed, every river I traced, every swamp I threaded became part of a living tapestry of resistance. The world had attempted to mold me into property. Instead, I had become its wraith. I encountered others along my path, escaped slaves, wanderers, and those brave enough to defy the tyranny of the South. Each became a thread in the web I wove across the Delta. They provided intelligence, shelter, and guidance, while I offered strategy, protection, and occasionally vengeance. My reputation alone ensured compliance and caution. A whisper of my name, Jacob the Butcher, carried weight enough to silence potential betrayals and caution even the most arrogant of overseers. I became a ghost story told to children in the quarters, a nightmare to plantation owners who slept uneasily, haunted by the knowledge that even their most broken property might carry the seeds of their destruction. The Delta was alive with secrets, and I learned them all. The intricate network of rivers, hidden inlets, and dense groves allowed me to move unseen, to observe without being observed, to strike when necessary and vanish before a response could be mounted. I became fluent in the language of nature. The shift of water, the rustle of leaves, the subtle changes in wind and animal movement. It was a knowledge no master could teach, no textbook could contain. My education had been forged in fire, sharpened by blood, and tempered in silence. The very earth had become my ally. Despite the solitude, I was not lonely. The memory of those I had avenged accompanied me like a constant presence, guiding my actions and reinforcing my purpose. Lucy, Samuel, Martha, and countless others, their voices, their suffering, and their courage shaped every decision I made. I carried them not as ghosts haunting me, but as spirits empowering me. The Delta's endless expanse allowed me to walk with them, to continue their struggle, to become an instrument through which their pain was acknowledged, transformed, and avenged. I saw the world differently now. Where others saw plantations and property, I saw opportunity, geography, and strategy. Where others saw roads and paths, I saw currents and conduits for movement and survival. Every community I encountered became a node in a larger network of resistance. I moved silently, listened intently, and acted with the precision and patience I had honed during years of servitude and vengeance. Each step was deliberate, every action measured, and each interaction a calculated investment in survival and influence. As I spent more years in the shadows, I began to understand the full breadth of the myth I had created. Slaves whispered my story not just as a tale of vengeance, but as a symbol of empowerment. Planters feared me not just as a man, but as an idea, the embodiment of retribution and the reminder that oppression breeds resistance. The boundaries of Mississippi, Louisiana, and the wider South became stages on which the legend grew. Every sighting, every rumor, every hushed conversation contributed to the network of fear and inspiration that had begun to stretch far beyond my immediate presence. The Blackwood plantation remained unclaimed, a monument to the consequences of cruelty and a warning to all who sought to perpetuate human suffering. The land, left fallow and haunted by memory, became a symbol in its own right. Its ruins were whispered about in quarters, shared in spirituals, and remembered in stories carried down through generations. Even as nature reclaimed the fields, the echo of that night, the night when fire consumed wealth, blood claimed justice, and the Delta absorbed a legend, remained indelible. The plantation was not just a ruin, It was a shrine, a testament to both punishment and liberation, and a physical representation of what a single, determined individual could accomplish against systemic cruelty. Though I remained hidden, I did not remain idle. The skills I had developed, the ability to move unseen, to understand networks, to predict and manipulate human behavior, became my tools for shaping outcomes beyond the reach of ordinary men. I intervened where I could, sometimes striking fear, sometimes offering protection, always advancing the principle that cruelty carries consequence and that those who build their lives on the suffering of others are never beyond accountability. The Delta became my classroom, my laboratory, and my fortress. Each day offered a new lesson, each night an opportunity to refine my craft. In quiet moments, I reflected on transformation, the metamorphosis from Jacob the slave to Jacob the butcher to Jacob the legend. It was not merely survival, it was evolution, the emergence of something uncontainable, defined by choice rather than circumstance. I had embraced the darkness within, not to surrender to it, but to harness it. In the process, I had transcended the limitations imposed by society, law, and expectation. Where others saw chains, I saw lessons. Where others saw oppression, I saw opportunity. Where others saw death, I understood the value of life's choices and the power of fear as a tool. The legend of Jacob did more than terrify, it inspired. Slaves and free men alike began to perceive resistance not as impossible, but as inevitable when one refused submission. My story circulated in coded spirituals, whispered through the quarters, and spread in the markets and churches, a constant reminder that the will to act against injustice could never be fully extinguished. The narrative was alive, independent of my presence, and continued to shape the world around me in subtle but profound ways. I became increasingly strategic in my interventions. I left messages, signals, and warnings to guide those who had suffered or were suffering. Sometimes it was a knife placed with intent, a subtle mark on a tree, or a pattern in the reeds along a riverbank, small actions that carried enormous significance to those who understood. Each movement was a reinforcement of my presence, and a reminder that oppression could never exist without consequence. Fear, yes, but also hope. The hope that even in the darkest circumstances, courage, cunning, and patience could reshape destiny. By now, decades had passed since the fire consumed the Blackwood plantation. The Delta itself had become a witness, silent but knowing. Every bend in the river, every moss-draped tree, every abandoned cabin held memory. I had become part of this landscape, as inseparable from it as the wind that carried its whispers. I moved through it with ease, a phantom in the daylight and a shadow in the night, leaving traces that confirmed the legend without exposing the man. In the end, I realized that my true power was not the knife or the fire, nor even the terror I inspired. My power was autonomy, the ability to define myself outside the dictates of masters, laws, and society. I had claimed freedom not just through action, but through identity, strategy, and myth-making. Jacob the slave was a memory, Jacob the butcher, a story, and what remained was something eternal, a presence in the consciousness of the oppressed and a shadow over the oppressors, a reminder that cruelty breeds consequences, and that no system can ever fully contain the human spirit. And so, I walked on, unseen, unbound, unbroken. The Delta stretched before me, a canvas of darkness and life, holding the echoes of fire, blood, and justice. I had become legend, ghost, and guardian simultaneously, carrying forward the lessons of survival, vengeance, and freedom into an uncertain but promising future. The world had attempted to define me as less than human, but I had chosen a path that transcended definition. I had become a force of reckoning, a harbinger of justice, and a ghost whose story would endure long after the waters of the Mississippi had claimed countless secrets. Even as the sun rose over the swamp, turning the black waters to liquid gold, I remained a shadow in plain sight. No one could capture me, no bounty could claim me, and no chain could bind me. The story of Jacob, the butcher of Mississippi, had become inseparable from the landscape, inseparable from the history, and inseparable from the consciousness of every slave, master, and bystander who had come to understand the price of cruelty. In the Delta, legend had triumphed over oppression, fire over complacency, and vengeance over silence. I had survived, but survival alone was never enough. The Delta had taught me that freedom was action, legend was influence, and justice was a form of immortality. And so, I disappeared into the shadows, a presence felt but rarely seen, leaving behind not just a trail of fear, but a testament to resilience, defiance, and the unassailable truth. No one who lives by cruelty can ever truly escape the reckoning they sow. Jacob the slave had died in the fire. Jacob the butcher had vanished. But Jacob the ghost, the idea, the legend remained, and in the delta's endless expanse, he walked forever, unseen, unbound, and indomitable.